Good morning, church. I am super excited to be speaking to you this morning. I don't think I've ever spoken to a crowd or an audience this big, and as opposed to being nervous, I'm actually really excited. One of the things that helps me is having a relationship with the people in the audience that I speak to, and so normally it's harder to go to a new congregation and speak to them because the room normally almost even feels colder. And I'm just glad to say I don't feel that this morning. I still feel that same warmth in this room. I'm also excited to be here just because I admire this congregation a lot and many of the things that you guys are doing. I love your focus on and efforts that you've put towards growing together. I love this topic that you guys are working towards, focusing on what we believe and wanting to go back and remind ourselves of what those foundations are, to focus on the object of that belief being Christ and getting to know him better. I think both of our congregations are actually united in doing that right now. I love the passion for evangelism and the effort to learn more about that and to grow in that as well. And so this morning, I'm just grateful to have this opportunity and to be a part of that journey and a part of that process. And so this morning, I'm actually here to speak specifically on the question when it comes to evangelism of why it is that we evangelize. Wisconsin is not really a place that comes first to, I think, anybody's mind. And for that reason, when I'm preaching up there or evangelizing up there, oftentimes I find myself asking the question, what am I doing? Why am I here? If I talked to myself 10 years in the past, I never would have imagined that I'd end up in Wisconsin and maybe even preaching there. And so that's how I relate to this question a lot is I oftentimes ask myself, why? Why am I doing what I'm doing? How did I end up here? Someone recently drew to my attention the fact that there are a lot of times that we should ask ourselves why, because we normally don't. How many times do you find yourself doing something and you're not sure what your motivation is in terms of doing it or know why you're doing that thing? Oftentimes we do things without knowing why. And so it's important to ask ourselves that question, especially on this subject, because if we don't know the why, or we're doing things with the wrong why, the wrong motivation, we can find ourselves getting into a lot of trouble. So as a congregation, let's explore that together this morning. Why evangelize? Why do we share the gospel? There are many reasons to share the gospel, but what I want to focus on this morning is 3 reasons specifically. Sharing the gospel out of obedience, sharing the gospel out of compassion, and sharing the gospel out of gratitude. While there are many reasons, these are the ones that we're going to focus on this morning. So let's start first with obedience. We share the gospel because it's a command. It's something that we've been commanded to do. So go ahead and turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 28. That's where we're going to start this morning. I did not plan for the first verse that I started with to be the one that you guys have been memorizing and the one that Lawrence talked about last week. So I'm glad that things really came together in that way. But that's where we're going to start. Matthew 28, starting first in verse 16, we're dealing with the first gospel in the New Testament and finding ourselves in the last chapter of that first gospel. So these are the last words that Matthew leaves on in his gospel. It's Matthew chapter 28, starting in verse 16, going to verse 20. It says, "Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age.'" I can't help but notice the absolute statements that are made all throughout that passage and the absolute wording that is used in this text. We call this passage the Great Commission, but that is quite literally the same thing as saying the Great Command. It's a command that's being said here. But what makes it great? What makes it so grand? It's the degree to which the statement is being applied and how much power we see in that statement. Its power and the authority in the statement encompasses all. It encompasses so much. Let's nest in that a little bit this morning. God goes to his disciples and he tells them to go to all nations. This isn't the only place that we get the Great Commission. We get it in Mark as well. And in Mark's gospel, he doesn't say all nations, he says the whole creation. Now, who does that exclude? Nobody. That's everyone. And I don't know if it made the disciples uncomfortable, but I would think that it would. It makes me uncomfortable in the sense that that's a lot of ground to cover. That's a lot of responsibility. But after saying that to the disciples, Jesus starts, or even before saying that to the disciples, he starts on the subject of how much authority he has been given. In the same way that no one is excluded in terms of who is the target of this command, who they're supposed to be going out and evangelizing to, no authority is excluded from which Jesus has. That's what he says in this statement. All authority has been given unto me. It all belongs to me. That's what Jesus says. And with that same authority, Jesus tells them they're supposed to use that authority to baptize people in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. He emphasizes or points to every aspect of the Trinity in saying that. And I think that emphasizes the seriousness of that statement. When I hear that, what I hear is almost like using someone's full government name, right? Like if my mother calls me, Roy, come here, that's one thing. But if she says, Roy, Michael, Mason, come here, that's some seriousness that we see in that statement. And I see that same thing in this statement that Jesus makes to the disciples. He could say to just baptize them in my name. He could say that just baptize them in the name of God, but he doesn't. He emphasizes each aspect of God. Baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And it helps us to understand the seriousness there. If these weren't just some of the last words of Jesus that he tells his disciples, again, it's also the last words that Matthew chooses to end his gospel on, which further shows that importance. With the same authority that he tells his disciples about, Jesus commands the disciples to share the gospel. And that command doesn't apply only to the 12, but also applies to us as disciples of Christ. So as we go through this text, a weight almost is built up with each and every word that is said. It's building upon itself, pertaining to the subject of evangelism. So simply put, the first reason that we should evangelize is because we've been commanded to. There are many reasons why we should evangelize. However, if we truly understand and truly believe what Jesus says in this passage, that he has this much authority, that could be or should be our reason enough alone. So why evangelize? Simply because God told me to. But that shouldn't be our only reason. It could be, but it shouldn't be. One of the things that we've been studying at Spring Street recently on Wednesday nights is the names of God. And one of the names of God that stick with me the most is the name Yahweh, just because of how interesting I find that name to be. As you look at the history of the name Yahweh, you see that people throughout history, on and on, consecrated it more and more and more. People went from saying that name to just the priests saying that name when they worship and serve, to not even the priests saying that name. They held this name so privately that eventually the original pronunciation of the name was forgotten to time. And I looked at that situation and I couldn't help but feel that these guys kind of missed the point. I think we can learn from how much they feared and respected God. That's why they held that name so privately, but they held it so privately that people couldn't even use the name anymore. What I learned from this situation is that we are to fear and respect God. That's the beginning of wisdom. That's what Ecclesiastes makes out to be pretty much the whole duty of man. But I think the mistake that was made here is that they feared God and respected him, but with a lack of compassion. And that's our next reason, and that's the next reason why we evangelize. We evangelize not only because we want to be obedient, but we also evangelize out of compassion. Turn with me now to Matthew chapter 9. Before God gives the Great Commission, in Matthew chapter 9, he's in the midst of his ministry doing all these great things. And it's going to help us to understand this next point. We evangelize because it's commanded, but we also evangelize out of compassion. So in Matthew chapter 9, in verse 35, it says, "And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless and like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few.'" We're told several times in Scripture that Jesus does things out of compassion, out of a compassion for others. Here we're told that in this text, he heals people who are being harassed and who are helpless out of compassion, because when he looks at them, what he sees is sheep without a shepherd. He sees lost people with no guidance. It's not the only place that we see this. We're told the same thing in Mark chapter 6, in verse 30 through 34. And this is in the context of right before he feeds the 5,000. In Mark chapter 6, verse 30 through 34, it says, "When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things." What's interesting to me about both of these passages is that it's out of compassion that Jesus doesn't only heal these people and feed these people, but when seeing them in need, he says they need to be taught and they need to be hearing the gospel. Like the Great Commission, there's a weight here that is built on every word that is said in this passage. Jesus points out a problem to us. He starts by saying the problem is there's a multitude of people who are in need. That's the problem. But he goes even further. Not only is there a multitude of people in need, but those people have multiple needs. They have physical needs that need to be met, but they also have spiritual needs to be met. So there's that, and then there's that, and then on top of that, what's even worse is not only is there a multitude of people, not only do they have a multitude of needs, but there are few people to help those people in need. He looks at his disciples and he says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few." Who are the harvesters he's talking about in this passage? It's the disciples. He trains them up to be fishers of men. We know that they eventually go on and to harvest in the same way that the Lord does. In this situation, he's talking to them and he's saying, "Look at what I'm doing now. Now go and do it for yourself. Do the same." But like the Great Commission, and like how it also applies to us, like it did to disciples, this final statement also puts that responsibility not only on the disciples, but on us as well. So why should we evangelize? Out of compassion. But that is to say that we should evangelize because there are so many people right now who are in need. And my natural response to that should be one of compassion. When I hear that there's such a huge need, I should immediately want to meet that need. I should want to help. And why? Because that's the response that Jesus had. Again, that could be our only reason, but it's not. There's more to it than that. When I was in high school, I had a friend named Miley. People actually at times called her Smiley Miley because she was just such a bright, enthusiastic, positive person. Wherever she was, she could always see the positive in the situation. She was always smiling and brightening up other people's day in that same way. She just kept a really good reputation because she was a good person. And she cared about everybody who was around her. I thought very highly of her. She was very important to me. And before she ran off to college, she gave me a gift. It was a wrapped gift, and she said, "Don't open this until you get home." So I went home, and I ripped it open, and what I found inside was a Book of Mormon, and I was disappointed. I was like, oh, okay, this is not what I was expecting. But once I opened it up, I saw that she'd written a personal note to me on the inside cover of this book, and I read it, and I just bawled and cried. Because she had to know me to write this message. She had to have that relationship with me, and she had to have a genuine concern for my well-being to say the things that she said. And it made me want to read that book. Now, let me give the warning this morning. I'm not here making this example to try to make anybody a Mormon this morning. I'm also not here this morning and using this example to bash Mormonism. While that situation, I don't think I can necessarily learn from what she was teaching. What I really pulled from that situation is how she taught it. She came across in a loving way, in a way that was apparent that she wanted a relationship with me and was clearly concerned for my well-being. And that is the exact same way that Christ evangelized, out of love and out of a concern for the need of other people. Before people listen to you, they want to know that you care. And people can easily tell when you don't. And that is apparent when you are evangelizing from the wrong place. The thing I'm about to say is the exact sentiment or the exact words that Jesus shares with the disciples in John chapter 15 and 16, which is this. You should expect to be hated for the name of God. Even to an extent, you should desire to be hated because of the name of God. That's what he warns his disciples. The world hated me, so when you go out being like me, representing me, they're going to hate you too. As a Christian, right, I should expect that. And like the disciples rejoice for suffering in the same way that Christ did in Acts, I should desire that as well. I should expect to be hated for the name of God. However, on the other hand, if people are hating the name of God because of me, that is a problem. And that's not what we hear in John 15 and 16. I can share the gospel for many reasons. But if I don't have my why figured out, there will be an issue in how I spread that gospel. I want to be spreading the gospel out of compassion for others because that's how Christ did it. And more than anything, I want people to see Christ in me. That's how you truly evangelize. It's in Philippians that Paul talks about people who are spreading the gospel with the wrong motivation. And he rejoices that regardless, the gospel is being spread. But beloved, I'd rather be in the group that's doing it for the right reasons than for the wrong. So whilst evangelism is commanded, love in evangelism is something that we see that is commanded as well. Right beside the Great Commission, we have the greatest commandment. And the greatest commandment is basically to love God and to love others. And the compassion in this lesson addresses that love for others. But it's out of a love for God that we evangelize as well, meeting that greatest commandment. And another way of saying that is simply gratitude. We evangelize out of obedience. We evangelize out of compassion, recognizing the need that other people have and wanting to meet that need. But we also evangelize out of gratitude. The person that first comes to my mind when I think about evangelizing out of gratitude is David. David demonstrates that gratitude to me in the Psalms. Go ahead and turn to Psalm 18. This is one of my favorite Psalms. Because in this psalm, David recognizes God as his rock and as his fortress. With each and every word that he uses, he paints God as his protector. The header of this psalm is super interesting. We're told that David writes this on the day that he recognizes that God has rescued him from all of his enemies. And I always try to sit and wonder, what day was that? Was there a specific point somewhere in his life that he noticed that God at some point smote all of his enemies all at once? Or is it at the end of his life that he's looking back and he can see in hindsight, it was God who brought me through all of these things? Another thing that's interesting to me about this text, before we even get into it, is the fact that not only does David recognize that God has rescued him from his enemies, but something that I even struggle to do at times, David puts his sins on par with his physical enemies. He recognizes that God hasn't only rescued him from the men that wanted his life around him, but the very sin that's trying to devour him. And so in response to that rescue and that salvation, David says this in Psalm 18 and verse 49, because God rescues him and protects him, he says, "For this I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations, and sing to your name." We see the same idea in Psalm 51. Turn there as well, please. Psalm 51 is my go-to communion psalm. And I'm sitting in communion, I'm trying to focus my mind and prepare my thoughts. I read Psalm 51 because it feels so appropriate to what we do at the table. But it expresses the same idea as Psalm 18, but hones in specifically on the problem that David has with sin. It's written specifically in response to David's sin with Bathsheba. And this is what he says in Psalm 51, starting in verse 10. He says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Lord, deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God. O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise." Think about what it means to be a king. People go to you for protection. That's why they raise you up, because they expect you to be the one to rescue them and you to be the one that protects them when you're a king. People look to you as a leader because they think there's something different about you. There's something that makes you unique, something that makes you special, more special than the rest of us. And for that reason, we want you to spearhead the group. When we see a king, they tend to stereotypically have an inflated ego, think they're the best thing since sliced bread. There's no one better than myself. Think about the personality that Nebuchadnezzar had. But instead, from Psalms like this, we see a lot of humility from David instead. I think that we can all relate to the fact that one of the most difficult things for a person to do is to admit that they're in need and to admit that they're wrong. And it's King David who does both of those things in this psalm. David recognizes that God has saved him from his own sin. And because of that, David says he will praise God and he will teach others about him. This same attitude and mindset takes my mind to the people that Jesus heals in the New Testament. It's in Matthew chapter 9, in verse 31, that Jesus heals two blind men. And he tells them to not tell anybody about what he's done for them. In the same way, in Mark chapter 1 and verse 45, he heals a leper. And he tells that leper, don't go and tell this to anybody except the priest. But the blind men and the leper, they don't do that. They go and they tell everybody. In Matthew chapter 9 and verse 31, we're told that the blind men, they went away and they spread his fame throughout all that district. Then in Mark 1 and verse 45, the leper, he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places. And people were coming to him from every corner. These men understood how serious their situation was. So when they were finally rescued from it, they were extremely grateful and extremely overjoyed. They were filled with excitement. And their attitude said, how can I not tell someone what has happened? It just seemed to pour right out of them. What's different for us is while Jesus told those people not to tell others, we've specifically been told to share it and to spread that news. So, beloved, how much more should it pour out of us? We evangelize because it's a command. In the Great Commission, but also in many other places in Scripture, God makes it clear that it's our responsibility and our duty as Christians and as his disciples. In that same way, as representatives, we evangelize out of compassion. We do that because it was Christ's motivation evangelizing, but also because that we see there are so many people who are in need. Jesus said, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. So seeing that need, it should elicit a response in us that is a desire to share the good news with other people. Not only should we share it out of obedience and out of compassion, but we should evangelize out of gratitude. When we recognize how in need we are when God saves us, we should have the desire to share the gospel, and it should pour out of us. And that should be because we want to do the same thing for other people. We want other people to share in the same salvation that we have. And when we truly understand the weight of what the sacrifice has been made for us, it should make us want to tell other people about it. So with that full understanding, I think what we now should ask ourselves is why we don't evangelize. If I'm not evangelizing, why am I not evangelizing? We started by talking about obedience. If I know it's my responsibility and my duty and I'm not doing it, maybe I don't fear God enough. Maybe I've forgotten how much power he actually has. Maybe I don't recognize how much authority is under his feet, and I need to be reminded of that. Maybe I'm lacking in compassion. Maybe I'm not seeing people in the right light, not seeing people the way that I should. It's easy for me to look out at the world and recognize them only as that. It's easy for me to look at the world and say, those are my enemies. But am I ever seeing them as sheep without a shepherd? Am I ever looking at my enemy and saying that person could also potentially be my brother or sister? Beloved, am I lacking in gratitude? Perhaps I've forgotten just how detrimental sin is in my life. Maybe I need to be reminded of just how profound Jesus' sacrifice was and how much was actually done for me, how nothing can measure up to that. Perhaps I need to know about this sacrifice better for myself in order to tell somebody else about it. If you think this morning, after hearing these things, that you have the wrong motivation, or you just never really thought about the why to evangelism, we need to fix our whys, or we need to fix our motivation. I think to just about every sermon that you hear, the application can always be to read more and to pray more. And in that same sense, this sermon is no different. I would say the application is to read more and to pray more. But let me give you the specifics to how. Let me give you a quick suggestion. We talked earlier about Psalm 51. And it's a special psalm to me. It's an amazing psalm because in it we see a perspective change from David. When I sin or when I wrong someone, normally I think about the person that I affected first and how I need to make up for that wrong, how I need to go and make things right with that person and apologize to that person. But that's not the perspective that we see from David in this psalm. In the beginning of Psalm 51, David says, "I've sinned against you and you alone, God." His mind goes first to God. That's who he sinned against. And that shows a different perspective. In Psalm 51, David asked God for a clean heart and a renewed spirit. He begs God not to take his Holy Spirit away from him. In terms of prayer, I think the important thing to realize here is that David knows that he has the wrong spirit and he asks God to change what's within him. So in that same way, if I have the wrong mindset when it comes to evangelism, if I have the wrong spirit when it comes to evangelizing, I should be specifically asking God and praying to God to fill me with a spirit of evangelism, a spirit of praise, a spirit of bravery, and a spirit of zeal. We're doing so much work, or we're called to do so much work, but we should be reminded that God is doing even more than we are. And some of that work is him putting his spirit in us. So like David asked for in Psalm 51, let's pray for a spirit of evangelism. But we should also read, and specifically read to be reminded. One of the things that we talked about in preparation for our curriculum at Spring Street is how to study. And I got the privilege of looking into how Jesus studied, which is an interesting topic to pull from Scripture. But we spent time talking about the Bible that Jesus specifically read. And that when he was walking on this earth, the Bible that he would have had would have been one of the Old Testament. And people debate as to which book it was that Jesus quoted the most. But one of those books that people debate over is the Psalms. And I realized that Jesus had a true appreciation for the Psalms, that he had a deep connection with the Psalms, and so I should too. The Psalms are called the heart of the Bible by some, because it's quite literally in the middle of your Bible. If you open up your Bible to the middle, you're most likely going to hit Psalms. But it's also called the heart of the Bible in the sense of that's where a lot of the emotion is. So in terms of reading to be reminded, and reading to help us figure out our why, to fix our motivation, I encourage us to start reading the Psalms. Every aspect of what we talked about this morning is in the Psalms. The Psalms proclaim how much power God has. The Psalms are people pouring out the emotions that they feel towards God. The Psalms are riddled with the specific personal thoughts and feelings of David. And he often writes about how entangling sin is. Like we talked about it before, he puts his sin on par with his physical enemies. And we read of him crying out to God in need, but also crying out praises to the Lord. So if we're finding trouble obeying God in a way that results in evangelism, if we're finding trouble finding that compassion, if we're finding trouble being grateful, the Psalms are the perfect example of people's emotion and compassion and obedience and their gratitude. So we know the whys this morning, and I encourage us that if we're not there, to start fixing it. To ask God to work within us, and then to read the scriptures to be reminded. And with that being said, the lesson is pretty much yours this morning, church. And as we've gone through this sermon, talking about why it is that we evangelize, why it is we should share the gospel, I hope you've been able to hear the gospel. We are all evangelists. And an evangelist quite literally means a good news-er, a person who spreads and shares the good news. So if you have trouble knowing where to start when it comes to evangelism, start by sharing your testimony, by telling your story. What did Jesus do for you? How did Jesus change you? But if you're here this morning and you look within yourself and you have trouble finding that story, that should tell you something. Jesus looked out into the world and he saw lost sheep, people without guidance and people without a shepherd. And if you're here this morning and you haven't been baptized, that lost sheep is you. In the same sense, you may already be a Christian here, but you may look within yourself and see that sin is still the master of your life. And in that sense, that shepherd or that sheep may be you as well. And so before jumping into the why of evangelism, make sure that your life is right with Christ. If you haven't accepted that sacrifice, now is the time to do that. But you have already, but you've forgotten the weight of that and what Christ has done for you and still letting sin ruin your life. Now's the time to make that right as well. Accept that sacrifice and make your life right with Christ. Then go out understanding or having the true motivation and knowing the true why in terms of how you spread the gospel. Beloved, the lesson is yours. If you're in need, come to the front as we together and stand and sing this invitation song.